Hey everyone, welcome to Singletrack. My name is Will, and today I'm going to take you through my review of this bike right here. This is the 2019 Giant Trance 29. Now firstly, I'm going to be explaining exactly what this bike is and what makes it special. Then we're going to go into some detail about how it rides on the trail and how it's held up over the past 4 months worth of testing. And just a little heads up for those of you who are new to our YouTube channel, consider hitting that subscribe button just down there because we have plenty more videos coming your way in the near future. Right, so the Trance 29 is brand new for 2019. It slots into the Giant full suspension lineup alongside the existing Trance 27.5. Now, although they share the same name, there are a few key differences. The first being obviously that this bike has 29-inch wheels. But it also has less travel than the 27.5-inch model. So we have a 130mm travel fork on the front, and that's mated to 115mm of travel on the back. Now those numbers are probably a little bit less than what some people expected a Trance 29 to have, but there's a very good reason. For Giant, they wanted to keep the back end of this bike nice and short, and that can be fairly difficult to do with this MAESTRO dual link suspension design. Through some modifications of the lower MAESTRO link, they've been able to keep the back end nice and short, 435mm, but to do so, they had to limit rear travel to 115mm. As I've found out though, this bike is a lot more about the quality of the travel than the quantity of the travel. Compared to the Trance 27.5, the geometry is also different on this 29er model. Not only is it longer, it's also slacker too. This bike has a 66.5-degree head angle, which is really slack for a bike in this travel class. It's also been paired to a reduced offset fork, so Giant has spec'd a 44mm fork offset on the front of the Trance 29. That reduced offset fork and that slack head angle are all about improving this bike's high-speed stability, and I'll touch on that in just a moment. For 2019, there are 4 Trance 29 models, 2 with alloy frames and 2 with carbon frames. This bike right here that I've been testing is the Trance Advanced Pro 2901. Now this is the second from the top of the range, but it still comes with a carbon fiber frame, which Giant claims weighs just 2.58 kilograms with the rear shock and hardware, which is quite lightweight for a trail bike. Instead of the DVO suspension on the top of the range model, this guy comes with a Fox suspension package, which to be honest, I kind of prefer. We've got the fantastic 34 float fork on the front, a very smooth and supple performer and really easy to adjust as well. And on the back we have this little Fox Float DPX2 shock. Now this is custom built for Giant, and that's because it's a very, very small size. This shock has just a 42.5mm stroke to control the 115mm of rear travel. We've got a piggyback reservoir on here, which is something you'd normally see on bikes with a lot more travel than this. And that little shock there works with Giant's MAESTRO suspension design. And this is a dual link suspension system, so we have an aluminium lower link and a composite rocker link up top. That's paired to a compact one-piece carbon fiber swing arm, and that's all rolling on smooth sealed cartridge bearings, which includes the trunnion mount up top and a single through axle down the bottom, which doubles as the lower shock mount. So it's very tidy and very compact as well. The main frame itself is relatively compact. We have a fairly short seat tube and a nice sloping top tube, so that gives plenty of standover clearance, but crucially, we still have room for a water bottle inside the main frame, which is fantastic. Other features on this frame, we've got a PF92 bottom bracket shell, ISCG 05 chain guide tabs, and we also have a combination of internal and external cable routing. The cables actually pop out of the down tube and run over the top of the lower MAESTRO link, which should make maintenance and servicing a little bit easier. In order to keep the price down on this bike while still having that Fox suspension package and the carbon fiber frame, Giant's made a few clever spec choices in order to bring that price down. So we've got a SRAM GX Eagle 1x12 drivetrain, SRAM Guide T 4-piston brakes on here, and we've also got Giant's own branded cockpit on here too. We do have some pretty slick wheels on this bike though. These are also Giant's own wheel set. They're called the TRX1, and they use hookless carbon fiber rims, which have a 27mm internal rim width. Now all up for this medium test bike here without the pedals, it weighs 12.67 kilos. And that's 27.87 pounds, which is about middle of the road for a 29er trail bike. In terms of setting up this bike, the first thing I did was remove the stock Giant lock-on grips. I'm not a fan of that squishy profile, so I removed those. I've been running a variety of different grips, including DMR death grips and also Renthal ultra tacky lock-ons. I also upgraded the dropper post to 150mm of travel. Now the small and medium frame sizes normally come with a 125mm dropper post. I've got exactly the same dropper here. This is Giant's own switch dropper post. This is 150mm of travel because there's a bit of room to play with here due to that short seat tube. Worth bearing in mind for existing Trance 29 users though, that because of the bent seat tube and the pivot that runs through the Maestro rocker link, there's only so far down in the frame that the seat post will go. So if you're looking at putting a longer dropper post onto your frame, make sure you get a good look at the total length of the dropper and how far it will go inside the frame. Really nice addition with this bike is the fact that it comes with tubeless valves, tubeless sealant and tie levers in the box. And that means setting up tubeless is really easy and it's also free too. That was the first thing I did on this bike, was to take out the tubes, set these tires up tubeless. Now I have actually switched the tires around, and that's because I prefer the Minion DHR2 tire on the front and I've got the DHF tire on the back. As far as pressures, I'm running 20 PSI in the front tire and 24 PSI in the rear tire. Out of the box, the Fox 34 float fork works really well. Very smooth, very supple, easy to adjust. But I was finding I wasn't quite accessing all of the travel, so I opened up the air spring, pulled out one of the stock volume spacers. Now from the factory, Giant installs 3 volume spacers inside the air spring of this fork. So I pulled one of them out to make it 2, and that's allowed me to more easily access full travel. What I've done is I've actually increased the air pressure, which has lifted up the fork a little bit. I'm also running the low speed compression dial, that's the blue lever on the top of the fork there, running that about halfway. So that combined with the slight increase in air pressure helps to keep the fork riding a little bit higher in its stroke. It means it better resists diving through the travel when you hit the brakes, riding down steep descents, and it just preserves the bike's geometry a little bit better. As for rebound damping, there are 22 clicks on the rebound dial on this fork. I'm running 8 clicks from the slower setting. As for the rear shock, I've had a good play around with air pressures on this. To begin with, I ran 30% sag, which is pretty standard for a full suspension bike, and I had 200 PSI inside the shock to support my 70 kilo riding weight. Now, although the suspension felt pretty good, I was finding I was bottoming it out occasionally on flat landings. I ended up increasing the air pressure to 220 PSI. Now, this reduced the sag to 25%, and it gave enough support inside the shock to basically eliminate bottoming out completely, which is great. Interestingly, with more pressure in the rear shock, it actually feels a little bit more lively. And I think the reason for this is that the shock is no longer sitting deeper into that firmer mid-stroke, but it's been lifted up a little bit higher into that more kind of active zone. So I found that 25% sag setting to be ideal on the back of this bike. Now the reason I mentioned sag is because the difference between 25 and 30% sag on this little shock is just 2mm at the O-ring. So you're going to want to get out the ruler and make sure you get that sag set up right in order to get the most out of this suspension design. As for rebound damping, the stock tune is quite light, and that means it's very pogo-y, very quick out of the box. There are 14 clicks on that red rebound dial, and I ended up just 2 clicks off the slower setting. Right, so enough about settings and a bit more about how this bike actually rides on the trail. From the very first ride, it becomes clear that the Trance 29 is not a long-legged cross-country bike, it's more of a shrunken down enduro bike. And the suspension has quite a supple off-the-top feel, and it's quite active as well, and that means if you're just plodding along, the suspension can bob up and down. That's kind of exacerbated by the draggy MAXXIS Minion tires, which are neither fast rolling nor lightweight. The DHR2 on the front there weighs 870 grams and the DHF on the back is 950 grams, so they're not particularly light tires for a trail bike. That means it's not exactly the most inspired climber. The low gearing certainly helps. We've got a 30-tooth chainring on the front and of course that big 10 to 50-tooth cassette on the back, and that means you can get a low gear, find your rhythm and steadily make your way up the climbs. I also found the 3-position compression switch on the rear shock to be very useful on the climbs. And for the most part, I left the shock in the full open position. If I knew I was going to be facing a long extended climb, I'd flick that blue compression switch into the middle position. And that would give a little bit more pedal efficiency and it would also lift the shock a little bit higher into its travel. If I was riding on bitumen or really smooth fire roads, I'd use the firmest position on the shock. Worth bearing in mind though that it's not a solid lockout, it is more a firm compression setting. The flip side to the active suspension design and grippy MAXXIS MINION tyres is that traction is quite good on technical single track climbs. The only thing is that when the gradient gets really steep, and we're talking sort of 15% and beyond, the tallish front end on this bike does become a little bit unwieldy, and it becomes difficult to keep that front tyre sticking all the way around those tight corners. We are talking about some pretty serious climbs though, and ultimately geometry is a compromise one way or the other. To see if I could get this bike rolling a bit quicker, I ended up putting on some lighter wheels and faster rolling tyres, and I also changed the cockpit to a slightly longer stem and narrower carbon handlebars. Now in this XC setup, I was able to get the total bike weight down to about 12.1 kilograms, and I took it along to a local dirt criterium just to see how it would go under some fast cross-country racing. It turns out pretty well, and the lighter wheels and tyres made a big difference to the rolling speed of this bike. What I also found while I was racing is that the MAESTRO suspension design does stiffen up under power, so when you're really giving it beans on the pedals, those two links stiffen up ever so slightly, put more of your pedal power into the rear wheel. It's more when you're just plodding along where that rear suspension tends to bob, so if you put the effort in, the Trance 29 will give it back to you. It's kind of a similar story with handling on this bike. The geometry is quite aggressive and it requires you to ride it hard to get the most out of it. It's a bike that requires you to commit to a front heavy riding style, because if you don't, you will find the front wheel tends to understeer, and that's exacerbated on really tight corners. To get my weight forward, I found dropping the stem down a little bit and also rolling the bars forward helped to encourage my riding position to be a little bit further over the front wheel. I also tried some slightly wider handlebars, and that had the same effect. It kind of brought my chest a little bit further over the steerer tube and put more of my body weight onto the front tyre. Once you commit to that front heavy riding style, the Trance 29 unlocks incredible high speed control. This bike is hugely confident on the descents, and really a lot more than a bike with just 115mm of travel should have. The front end geometry has a lot to do with that. This bike has a lot of trail, 117mm to be exact. Now if that number's meaningless to you, I'll give you a bit of a comparison to the last test bike I reviewed, which was the Canyon Neuron CF. Now that bike had just 99mm of ground trail compared to 117 on the Trance 29 here. And the difference between descending on these two bikes is pretty substantial. Whereas the Neuron would feel a little bit wriggly and a little bit nervous on steep, fast, rough descents, the Trance 29 just feels planted. This bike is rock solid, and all it wants you to do is just go faster. This comes down to the longer trail figure and the stronger caster effect that's at play on the front wheel. Basically what that means is the front wheel is more inclined to straighten up after it's been knocked offline. I had a really good example of this on one of my local test trails, which has a really rough and fast descent. I actually clipped the right-hand grip on a tree going around a corner at about 40 to 42 kilometers an hour. I honestly thought I was going to die, but the front wheel flicked back to pointing straight ahead almost instantaneously, and I carried on down the trail as if nothing had happened. Now when you're really walloping along very rough, fast descents, you will discover the limits of that rear travel. I should point out that the DPX2 shock on this bike does a marvelous job at keeping the back end nice and controlled on a really wide range of riding speeds. Whether you've got a big heavy landing or kind of rapid high speed hits, the damping on this shock is very good. That said, there's still only 115mm of travel on the back of this bike, so the bigger the rocks get and the bigger the impacts, the more you're going to get pinballed around on this bike. Even still though, the Trance 29 is so stable and so sorted with its geometry that you can get away with a lot on this bike. Now the flip side to all that stability is that the Trance 29 does have a tendency to stand up if you hit the brakes while going through a corner. So I found if I had to tap the brakes while I was mid-corner, the bike would kind of stand up, which would mean I'd understeer and basically blow out the corner. The best way to manage this is of course to stay off the brakes. You really have to commit to cornering on this bike, lean it over to get it through the turns. And luckily those MAXXIS MINION tyres deliver fantastic traction in a wide variety of conditions, and the cornering grip you get on these is really good. So it gives you plenty of confidence to lean the bike over in the turns, but you do have to push it quite hard. It's got quite a dynamic feel to the handling, so you do need to move the bike around, especially through repeated S-bend turns. And I have found this to be a little bit fatiguing on twistier trails. If I was starting a ride feeling a little bit low on energy, this bike did feel a little bit like hard work on those tighter, twistier corners. But when you are feeling good though, holy shit, this bike is an absolute freight train. It is very fast. Now over the 4 months of testing, I didn't have too many issues with the parts on this bike. The TRX1 wheelset has proved to be really solid, and I will have a separate review of this wheelset coming soon to the website, so stay tuned to singletrackworld.com for that one. I did, however, have the main main pivot of the Maestro linkage loosen up on me a couple of times. Now this is worth mentioning because to tighten the nut on the drive side of the main pivot, you will need an open crescent wrench, which isn't something that's going to come on any multi-tools, and I doubt that many people will ride with one in their backpack. My advice is to check it periodically with a torque wrench, and if it's needed, put a dab of fresh Loctite on the thread of the main pivot just to make sure everything stays nice and snug. Right, so 3 things that could be improved on this bike. The first one has to be the brakes. The SRAM Guide Ts are okay, but on this bike, which is capable of going very, very fast, they are not powerful enough at all. They also feel kind of cheap on what is still a relatively expensive bike. The second one is I'd like to see a little bit more armoring around the rear end of the bike. I've got a few paint chips on the swing arm, notably around the cable entry port on the drive side chainstay. And I've also heard from other Trance 29 owners that the paint does chip fairly easily, so if you want to keep it looking fresh for as long as possible, it might be worth investing in some frame protection. The third area for improvement is the dropper post. Now it worked pretty well all throughout testing, but it's certainly not the smoothest operator. I'm also not a fan of the handlebar lever, which feels a bit cheap and wobbly. That's probably the first thing I'd upgrade if this were my bike. And on to 3 things that I loved about the Trance 29. Well, the first one has to be the unflappable high-speed geometry. Certainly the numbers that Giant has given this bike, along with that reduced offset fork, give it a load of stability and a load of confidence on the descents. It certainly helped me push my riding limits and go as fast as possible on trails where I really should have been on longer travel bike. That brings me on to the second thing that I love about the Trance 29. That is the Fox suspension package. It is absolutely superb. In particular, that piggyback rear shock, which does a bang up job of keeping the back end nice and controlled, even when there's only 115 mil of travel. And the third thing I loved about the Trance 29 is this MAXXIS MINION tire combo. It's great to see a 29er trail bike be given some proper grippy tires. Even though they're not the lightest, they certainly deliver fantastic grip in a wide variety of trail situations. You could always give it a bit more speed by putting a faster rolling tire on the back, but I love that Giant is committed with some proper tires on this bike. Overall, I've really enjoyed my time with the Trance 29er. It's an incredibly confident and capable short travel trail bike. It's got fantastic geometry that inspires high-speed shenanigans, and really, out of the trail bikes I've tested recently, this is one of the few that I'd happily turn up to the start line of an enduro race. On smoother and tamer single track, it's not the most sprightly of trail bikes, and for that reason, I'd still recommend the Trance 27.5 for newer and less experienced riders, because it is a more comfortable bike to ride, and with the smaller wheels and steeper geometry, it is a little bit easier to ride as well. If you're ready to commit to going absolutely flat out on rough technical single track, but you don't want a long travel heavy enduro bike, then the Trance 29 should be on your list. In my view, this is the most progressive Trance that Giant has ever produced, and certainly it's one of the most capable short travel trail bikes on the market. If you've got any questions for me about the Trance 29, make sure you drop them into the comment section below. And if you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up. If you'd like to read more about the Trance 29, make sure you see my full review at singletrackworld.com. Otherwise, that's it from me, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. Tooroo!